This is Neil Schneider for MTBS-TV. We're at AMD's suite at CES 2015. To my immediate right is Richard Huddy, Chief Gaming Scientist for AMD. Welcome to the program, Richard.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much for having me on the show, and cool to be here.
Chief Gaming Scientist. I mean, that's quite the title. I mean, to not just be in gaming, but a scientist of gaming. How did that come to be?
Well, it's true as well, which is the cool thing about it, because it is a nice sounding title. My background is very much in programming. I understand the architecture of chips, how games are put together, how they're layered on top of APIs and drivers and silicon and so on. So a pretty deep understanding of the whole stack, from what people are trying to achieve to all the details of how that ripples through to implications of our own manufacturing and so on. And Chief Gaming Scientist, I guess because I've been in this for quite a long time now. I started out in 3D about 15 years ago.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you have, I mean, of course, AMD has these wonderful technologies on display. I mean, there are APUs, CPUs, graphics cards, and what I'm seeing along this table are a number of innovations. What do we have behind us?
We have a whole wide selection of things here. For us, AMD absolutely is gaming. There's more to AMD than that, but for those of us in the kind of area where I am in graphics particularly, AMD is gaming. Here we have a gaming setup where you've got 3 monitors connected, all playing on the same setup at the same time, which just gives you a wider field of view. Now, not everyone will go for this kind of portrait setup with the monitors. You can arrange them in all sorts of different configurations. This is called Eyefinity, and you can have up to 6 monitors attached to every graphics card. And if you're crazy enough, you can stick 4 graphics cards in a PC and have 24 monitors on them. Way over the top gaming setup for people who really want every single pixel the way it can be. And as we go across to my right, we see a whole bunch of different setups which are not about Eyefinity, but about a new monitor technology which has recently been introduced called FreeSync. And what FreeSync does is it gets rid of probably the last real painful artifact of kind of PC gaming, where monitors used to run at fixed refresh rates, and you would either have VBlank on, in which case your game would kind of lock out at 60 frames a second and you wouldn't see more than that, or you'd have VBlank off, and your game might run faster than that, but you'd get tearing. This set of monitors over to my right get rid of all those artifacts. Now you get stutter-free gaming, which is that kind of 60 hertz just locks on you every now and then and irritates you. Stutter-free, so none of that 60 hertz nonsense, and not a tear in sight. You watch the games there, and the frame rates are just silky smooth. And the interesting thing is, you play on one of those setups at, say, 40, 50, 60 hertz, it genuinely feels better than the old 60 hertz with VBlank on, because the game is always delivering its frames as fast as it possibly can at the rate that the games player can consume it. It's a really beautiful experience. Got to be tried to be believed.
Absolutely, absolutely. If we look at this display right here, I mean, I understand that there's like 3 4K panels. Is that correct?
That's right.
I mean, when I think of 4K and the high resolution associated with 4K, I'm thinking that you need a lot of processing power to get one display to work, let alone 3 of them. And am I correct that this is all running based on one graphics card?
It's a single graphics card which is doing the job here. Though if you don't have enough horsepower in one graphics card, you can add a second, a third, or even a fourth. I mentioned that you can have 24 displays. That's really, really way over the top. A more natural setup is to have, say, 2 or 3 graphics cards all teaming up on the same game, and they really do deliver an experience which is pretty much 3 times the frame rate or something like that. And that means that a 4K display will run even a game which has pretty high settings enabled, and you can still get a great experience out of it. 4K, if you've got a mid-range graphics card, you're probably going to find that a bit painful. But if you take a high-end graphics card, particularly if you take 2 or 3 of them, you can get a fantastic experience out of the very highest end games you can get these days.
And yet this is, again, based on one graphics card running 3 4K panels. Is it being scaled? Like, is it just like a 4K being spread out over 3 panels, or is it actually being rendered as 4K, 4K, 4K?
It's 12 million pixels here which are being generated every frame, and it's doing I'm not certain whether it's doing 30 frames a second or 60 frames a second. It'll be somewhere around there, and it's certainly delivering all 12 million pixels without compromise every frame, yeah.
Amazing. Remind me, which graphics card is in there?
This is a 295X2.
Wonderful.
So single graphics card, fastest graphics card in the world at the moment on a PC.
Okay, now let's talk about FreeSync again. Now, from what I gather, and I know you talked a little bit about this, is that by using this FreeSync technology, you get rid of those tearing artifacts that we often see. But we've had technologies like VSync, and I think it recently adaptive VSync. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit as to why is this different from traditional VSync? Why is this an innovation?
Okay, so the old technologies that we used to have to put up with the V-blank interval, which was a fixed period of time, came from the old CRT monitors, the old cathode ray tubes, where the cathode ray would scan across, and it was doing a little bit faster than this, but it would scan across each individual line, get to the bottom of the frame, and then jump back up to the top. And this always took a fixed amount of time. You'd run at a 60 hertz refresh or a 75 or 85 or whatever it might be. And the fact that that screen had to be traced out at a particular speed meant that the graphics card, although it could generate frames faster, could never send them to the monitor faster than that. Well, we have 144 hertz gaming monitors these days. Most of the 4K monitors top out at about 60 hertz. But it's really, really commonplace for folks who buy gaming monitors these days to look for 144 hertz monitors. That's a really fast refresh rate. And they'll have perhaps even down to 1 millisecond response time on the LCD. It's nothing like the old tech that was built into CRTs. Well, because we've been working with that legacy of technology, we've insisted on supporting the same kind of capabilities all the way through. And it just isn't necessary. If a monitor's capable of taking frames at 144 hertz, it's probably capable of taking them at 123, 113, 107, 109, all sorts of random kind of rates in between. And if the monitor can be tweaked a little bit, and this is what FreeSync is, it's that small tweak to the hardware in the monitor, if it can be tweaked a bit to dynamically adjust its refresh rate with every frame that comes along, so that instead of being spaced exactly 1/60th of a second, these are spaced as the graphics card can generate them and as the game can generate them, then you get a situation where the graphics card can send them at the same rate that the monitor can accept them, and there never has to be tearing. Yeah, you just get away from all of the artifacts.
It almost sounds like the old VSync model, the graphics card and the monitor were actually speaking a completely different language from each other at this point, compared to FreeSync, where they're literally syncing up exactly according to each of their capabilities.
Yeah, I think, I don't know that they're different languages, but the timing that comes from the V-blank interval is a painful artifact. I remember getting a Dell monitor once that could run at 200 hertz, and that was great, 200 hertz, but you still got tearing. You still got tearing because it would be the case that partway through generating one frame, the monitor would be halfway through the frame, and then the graphics card would say, "I've got a new frame for you. Take it, whether you like it or not." And you'd get this, first half is one way, second half is another way, and you get a tear where things are physically displaced on the screen. Well, that just simply doesn't have to be that way, and FreeSync has a protocol in there which says, you know what, if you're inside a particular frequency that the monitor says it can cope with, then let's just go. Let's go and let's make it really smooth, and smooth in a way that you've always wanted. When you try it, you won't go back.
So let's talk about the ramifications of this a little bit. I mean, gamers, there's actually an industry standard that they encourage like 60 frames per second or better. Maybe that's not quite right anymore, but
I think professional gamers look at about 100 hertz as the kind of place where it tops out, where you don't notice much difference over that. Yeah.
Okay, so well, you're the chief gaming scientist, so you would know. But by using FreeSync technology, does that reduce that requirement? Is it no longer necessary to get frames that high to avoid the tearing?
Well, so the tearing will disappear from. If you take a good quality FreeSync monitor that supports, say, 30 to 90 hertz, then you'll get no tearing in that frequency range. And for all practical purposes, that's the kind of frequency range that we care about. If you're playing a game and it's running at less than 30 frames a second, you're probably in a situation where it's a bit painful to play, and you'd rather not do that. Up above 90 hertz, well, you'd have to be a professional gamer to notice the difference. That kind of range covers pretty much everything that you or I would care about, I suspect. if you really want the best experience, then you don't want an artifact of the technology to get in the way, and that's what the V-blank interval was. Locking yourself at 60 hertz or 75 hertz, it doesn't work well. What was particularly annoying about that is if you miss the 60th of a second just by a nanosecond or two, you'd have to wait for the next one. And instead of waiting, therefore, a 60th of a second between frames, you'd wait 2/60ths of a second or 1/30th of a second. And if you think about what's happening there, it's maybe a little bit subtle. You go a 60th of a second for a frame, a 60th, and you miss one, suddenly a 30th. And the impact of that is that you actually feel a stutter in the experience. And what you really want is for the monitor to say, I can just take these frames anywhere in this frequency range. If it dips below 60, that's okay. Just give it to me after 1/57th of a second or something like that. And you don't feel the stutter. The experience is significantly better using FreeSync than VBlank. It's not the same thing. It's not like we've got a slightly better way. This is a substantially better way, and two really big benefits come with this. One, this is, as far as we're seeing, no more expensive on monitors than previous monitor generations used to cost, which is pretty nice. We like an improvement in tech without any extra cost. And secondly, it's an industry standard. We have seen announcements here at CES 2015 from LG. Samsung had already announced that they were here. They're the #1 monitor vendor in the world for 4K monitors, and all their monitors are going FreeSync in 2015. We've seen BenQ come here as well. There's a whole range of really important players, LG, ViewSonic, so many players that just say this is the way monitors should be.
Now, let's talk a little bit about virtual reality. I mean, Oculus is a working example, immersion reality. There's all kinds of head-mounted displays coming to market. Does FreeSync have a place with this as well?
Well, it might do, but it isn't completely clear to me. What you need with virtual reality is a tremendously low latency response to movement. So the moment you move and the time between that and the system reacting to you and showing you photons, showing you light, which reflects that movement, and reflects not like a mirror, but actually demonstrates that movement, that has to be really fast. That has to be sub 10 milliseconds or so. Now, that happens to be in the same kind of order of delay that we're talking about with FreeSync. A 100 hertz monitor running FreeSync would give you 10 milliseconds. But FreeSync has the totally adaptive nature built into it, which means that one frame can come faster or slower than the last frame. Typically, with people who are building VR systems, and Oculus Rift is the most notable of those at the moment, they actually want a highly predictable frame rate, so they like 90 hertz or 100 hertz absolutely locked on. Now, it may be that we can take some of the tech from FreeSync and bring that into Oculus's solution, and they're looking at this and looking at ways of reducing latency further. But actually, the most important stuff for them is locking at a very high refresh rate, because latency is the killer. For us on FreeSync, what we're saying is latency is not the biggest issue, a 30th of a second or a 60th of a second. Those are very tolerable in many gaming environments, but for VR it's not.
So is AMD working on any key VR initiatives right now?
Well, we have a couple of things which are quite nicely tuned for VR. First of all, Oculus were kind enough to say in the I think last quarter of 2014 that we have about the most comprehensive suite of features in our silicon at the moment. We have things like an asynchronous compute engine. Would you like me to tell you what an asynchronous compute engine is? Yeah, you probably should. So an asynchronous compute engine...
Wait, let me ask you. Okay. What is an asynchronous compute engine?
Well, Neil...
We have that on record, right? Okay.
We have that on record.
All right, go ahead.
An asynchronous compute engine is a compute engine which can run out of sync with the graphics pipeline. And it means that you can send compute tasks through the GPU, and they can overtake tasks which are in the graphics pipeline. That means that you have extremely low latency processing for specific compute tasks, and it means that you can get an answer back from the compute engine which will influence the graphics engine in this frame. And that's typically very hard to do. It's something we've been building into consoles and been building into our PC architecture over the last handful of years. We understand that having extremely low latency compute is sometimes a vital component to addressing problems that games programmers want to solve. Now, for virtual reality, one of the uses of an asynchronous compute engine is that you might want to do a little bit of cheating. And there is a saying in graphics that if you're not cheating, you're not trying, and I think that's quite a nice one. Sometimes you have to cheat. Rather than generating the whole of a frame as you move a tiny amount, the right thing to do is to reproject the frame. And that can be done, the previous frame, that can be done as a kind of intermediate, and you use that temporarily. Well, you can do that reprojection using the asynchronous compute engine, get the result very quickly, and yet let the graphics pipeline continue to flow. This kind of quite complicated architecture inside the chip, that's a big deal.
Well, let's talk about another big deal, Mantle. I mean, there's, what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of performance enhancements from, as they say, getting down to the metal of the chip. Can you elaborate a little bit more as to what Mantle is?
So Mantle is it's a spot-on subject for this conversation, actually, and I appreciate you asking the question, because I should have gone into Mantle because it relates quite nicely to VR. Mantle is an API that AMD introduced a little over a year ago. The very first game shipped in January 2014. That was Battlefield 4. And we have seen a collection of, I think, 9 or 10 games come out over 2014 which used Mantle. And in the vast preponderance of cases, what we have seen is that there is a substantial performance improvement for folks who are playing on Mantle versus the old DX11 path. Now, the performance improvement is one very clear benefit, and it's typically somewhere between, say, 20 and 40%. Sometimes it's a little higher than that, but that's a typical kind of range. And it's pretty significant if you're worried about latency. The fact that you can therefore reduce latency by something like 20% is worth a lot. But there's a very interesting use of Mantle that we saw in Star Citizen recently, where a PC programmer said, okay, I'm feeling a little bit inventive today, and they decided to solve some problems quite creatively. They took the frame that they were going to generate, and instead of generating alternate frames on the GPUs, which is the traditional taking it in turns kind of way, alternate frame rendering, which actually adds one frame of latency to the experience. Instead of doing that, they said, let's get inventive today. Why don't we generate the left-hand side of the frame with one GPU and the right-hand side simultaneously with the other GPU, which means that, in effect, no GPU has to do more than half a frame. And then you composite the two and show them to the user. Well, the impact of that is actually quite significant on latency, and typically we see the crossfire setup that I talked about with multiple GPUs adding latency. It adds an extra frame. It's a slight reduction in the quality of the experience in terms of just a little bit of extra lag. But if you are creative with Mantle, as these guys were, then you can see that you can actually half the latency with two GPUs. And that, obviously, when it comes to VR, is a very interesting possibility, because it's all about latency right now. For the next 4 or 5 years, I would guess, with VR, it's all about latency.
Now, is Mantle readily available in all AMD graphics cards, or is it limited to certain levels of graphics cards?
It's available on everything which is what we call GCN, the Graphics Core Next. So that's our modern R9 series or R7 series, and actually our APUs as well. And interestingly, the biggest benefits in terms of just a performance enhancement tend to come on the APUs. They typically show something like the 40% performance gain out of Mantle.
Now, I know from what I've seen of AMD, they're very supportive of standards. I mean, they're big parts of Visa and I think part of Chronos as well. But
FreeSync's a big deal. That's absolutely through an open standard, and we could have gone the other way. Yeah.
What about Mantle? I mean, there's talk that DirectX and Chronos are looking at deep access to the metal as well. Would it be competitive or complementary? What are your thoughts on this?
So we are absolutely committed to open standards and driving the ecosystem forward. So this is not competitive. We do not see Mantle as competing with DX12 or any future version of GL. We share the learnings that we have, and we absolutely support Microsoft with their initiatives with DX12, which should come along this year, and Chronos with their work on OpenGL and generally making these low-level APIs more efficient. We 100% support those, and I've publicly said before that, you know what, if DX12 rocks the way it should do, we'll put Mantle down when it comes to performance. It solves the problem. We're only here to solve problems.
Actually, thinking from AMD and their chips, you're in a unique position where AMD graphics cards are in pretty much all the modern consoles. Is Mantle being implemented in consoles as well? Is there a potential for that?
That's a really interesting question, and it goes to the heart of what AMD is trying to achieve here. Mantle, I think we best describe it as a console-like API for the PC. And while we look at taking Mantle to other AMD platforms, that means that taking it onto a console doesn't make a great deal of sense. Because if I carry a console-like API onto a console, shouldn't I just use the console API? Microsoft and Sony support their developers super well. They know exactly how to do it. We don't need to tread on their toes by trying to squeeze Mantle in there. It isn't part of our agenda. So no, we're not trying to go that way. Philosophically, it doesn't make sense to put a console-like API on a console.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I would love to see the lab of a chief gaming scientist one day, but nonetheless, thank you again for joining us on MTBS TV.
It has been a very great pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure. This is Neil Schneider, MTBS TV. We'll be back with more from CES 2015. Thank you for watching.